Good morning and greetings and namaste. I thought I would start with namaste. It's a Sanskrit greeting, and what it means is I honor the place in you in which the entire universe dwells. I honor the place in you that is of love, that is of truth, that is of beauty, and that is of peace. When you are in that place in you, and I am in that place in me, we are one. So I'm going to address to you this morning from that place in me where we are one, and I invite you to listen to me from that place in you where we are also one. I have been an avid writer. I keep an active journal. I've written more since the tragedy that happened almost 18 years ago, January 21st. A few days ago was the 18th anniversary of this tragedy. And I remember after having lost Tariq, I made this entry in my journal. There's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart. There's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart. But a broken heart is an open heart. If one can learn to live with an open heart, gentle transformations begin to happen. So part of my goal this morning is to open your hearts. So I truly believe that if we had more people with open hearts, we would have less violence, because an open heart can deliver and receive love more easily. And I find in my travels that we are a very angry society. We are very quick to judge and very quick to close our hearts. And I remember I gave a talk in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to many parents that had lost children. And I started with this quote, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards, and he said, I was very moved with your opening quote, and it reminded me of a quote by Rumi. Rumi is a very famous and well-known Sufi poet. And he said to me, I also practice as a Sufi Muslim. And he said to me, since you are a Sufi, I'm sure you know this quote. And I told him, Rumi was prolific. He wrote 138,000 quotes. So I know many of it, but I don't know all of it. Please share with me which quote are you talking about? And he said, what Rumi said is, God will break your heart over and over and over and over and over again until it stays open. So my sisters and brothers, one way not to have your heart broken, make sure it is open. Tariq was my only son. I have a beautiful daughter, but he was my only son. He was a student at San Diego State University, great writer, great photographer, great sense of humor, a joy to be around. And he worked as a pizza delivery man while he was going to school, and this was the last delivery on a cold Saturday night. He was lured to a bogus address by 4 youth gang members. It was an apartment building, middle-class area in San Diego. The restaurant he worked for routinely delivered in that area. They didn't think about any danger here. He went and knocked on several doors, and nobody ordered the pizzas. So he came to his car, put the pizzas in the trunk, and he climbed into the driver's side seat. He was accosted by 4 youth gang members. 3 of them were 14-year-old, and the leader of the gang was an 18-year-old who handed a 9mm handgun. And as my son was trying to leave the driveway of the apartment building, the 18-year-old gave the order, bust him bones. And he fired 1 round, which entered my son's body right here under the left shoulder blade, traveled across the upper part of his body. It actually exited from his right armpit. But it was fatal. And the coroner explained to me, he said the bullet followed a perfect path. A perfect path, I queried. I thought that was an interesting choice of words. He said to me, I'm not trying to be insensitive, Mr. Khamiza. We do not see a path like this very often. And what it means in my lingo is that it destroyed all the vital organs, and Tariq died, drowning in his own blood, over a lousy pizza at the age of 20. The sudden, senseless death of an innocent, unarmed human being. The overwhelming grief of a family. The total confusion as you try to absorb a new, hideous reality. And even though this was 18 years ago, those early days are etched deeply on my mind, on my heart, and my soul. And I went through all the emotions you would expect a parent to go through. Despair, overwhelming grief. I was suicidal at one point because I really did not know how to go on with my life. And I worked as an international investment banker. I speak a half a dozen languages. It was routine for me to fly in from London, change planes, and fly to Tokyo. And then it literally took all of my willpower just to climb out of bed. And I really lived in a different world. I didn't even know there were such things as youth gangs. But since Tariq was murdered by a gang member, I started to look at the problem. And I asked some very fundamental questions, like why do our kids join gangs? And the answers I got horrified me. I was told they join gangs because they are respected. Gang members are respected by their peers. Many of their peers dress like the gang members. I was told they join gangs because they live in areas where if they don't join gang A, they're targeted by gang B. They essentially join for protection. Or I was told that they join gangs because they do not have a sense of belonging in their own homes. Over the last 18 years, I have met many gang members, and I'm shocked to meet gang members that come from 4 to 5 generations of gang members. So essentially, they were born in this tradition, that they really had no choice. I asked, how deep is the problem? It's huge. The Economist study, they took 25 first world countries in the world, England, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, Canada, and they added all the kids in those 25 countries that died of gun violence, and they took the total and multiplied that by 11. That is how many we lose in the United States of America. We are by far the most violent first world nation in the world. And that's not good. We are a tremendous impact on the global culture. If you travel overseas, what do you see? Starbucks, KFC, McDonald's, Levi's, American music, American movies. What happens in the United States of America eventually happens in the world. And I'm sad as an American citizen to share with you that we are also now exporting our violence. Now, I took a different response to this tragedy. What I saw here is that there were victims at both ends of the gun. I saw that my son was a victim of the 14-year-old gang member. I saw the 14-year-old gang member as a victim of society, of American society. And that begs the question, who is society? Well, in my humble opinion, every one of us who is an American is responsible for the society we've created. Societies do not just happenstance, we contribute to it. And children killing children is not a mark of a civil society. So who's the enemy here? Is it the 14-year-old who murdered my son, or is it the societal forces that forced a young African-American man at the age of 11 to join a gang, and at the age of 14, he shot and killed my son to prove himself to the gang? I thought that was the enemy. So 9 months after Tariq died, to help me and my family deal with this tragedy in a meaningful way, I founded the Azim Khamiza Foundation, and our mission statement is to stop kids from killing kids by breaking the cycle of youth violence. And we essentially have 3 mandates. Our first and foremost mandate is to save lives of children. It doesn't have to be your child that dies. When a child dies in any community, and we just experienced that at Sandy Hook and Newtown, we're all diminished. 6, 7 years old were murdered. So that's our first mandate. Our second mandate is to empower the right choices so kids don't end up in gangs, guns, violence, alcohol, and drugs. And our third mandate is to teach the principles of nonviolence, of empathy, of compassion, of forgiveness, most importantly, of peacemaking. And I started with a very simple premise that violence is a learned behavior. Now, if you accept that as a truism, nonviolence can also be a learned behavior, but you have to teach it. These kids are not going to learn those principles through osmosis. So soon after I started the foundation, I reached out to the grandfather and guardian of my son's killer. You met him on the video. And I remember that first meeting, the district attorney that handled this case introduced me to the grandfather. And I told him, I'm not here in the spirit of retribution or revenge. I'm not here screaming that your grandson killed my one and only son and he should be hung from the highest pole. How does that improve society? Rather, I'm here reaching out to you in the spirit of compassion and forgiveness, because what I really see here is we both lost a child. My child died, and you lost your child to the juvenile justice system. In fact, he was the first 14-year-old in our state of California to be tried as an adult. There's nothing I can do to bring my son back from the dead. And quite frankly, there's nothing you can do to get your grandson out of the adult juvenile justice system. And I've started this foundation with a lofty mission of stopping kids from killing kids. And I cannot do this by myself. So I'm here to ask for your help. Will you help me? Because while I can't get my son back from the dead, while you cannot get your grandson out of prison, the one thing you and I can do is to make sure that no other young soul in our community ends up dead like my son or ends up in prison like your grandson. That we can do. Will you help me? And he was very quick to take my hand of forgiveness. And the first thing he said to me, he says, Azim, thank you for reaching out to me. Ever since I found out that my grandson was responsible for killing your son, I've been praying that someday I get an opportunity to meet you and express my condolences. And of course, I will help you. Now, I started the foundation with $8,000 in my home office. Fast forward 17 and a half years later, which we are 17 and a half years old, we are over 48 employees. We have programs, we are teaching these principles of nonviolence. I personally have been in front of 1 million kids. We have another 8 million kids that have seen our programs through broadcasts into the classrooms. The grandfather and I are still together, and we will be together for the rest of our lives. And I'm really pleased to tell you that the programs we are doing are working. We've taken middle schools that are highly violent, that are gang infested, high rates of suspension, high rates of expulsion, failing all state and federal standards. In 3 years, we're turning them around, where we are cutting expulsion and suspensions by over 80%. Not only are they meeting state and federal standards, they're now actually excelling. So we are showing that nonviolence is something that you can actually teach. 11 years ago, I was asked by an organization in Columbus, Ohio, to develop a program for violent youth. And Sunshine introduced me the program that I started was called Constant and Never-Ending Improvement. I'm better tomorrow than I'm today. I'm better day after tomorrow than I'm tomorrow. Constant and never-ending improvement. It's a good name for a program for offenders. In this particular program, we have 3 pillars. Our first pillar is spirituality. We're not a religious organization, but we are a spiritual organization. Because I remember when I lost Tariq, my degrees in math and finance were pretty useless, and I was educated at some pretty good schools in England. What helped me was a strong spiritual foundation. My mom was very spiritual. My dad was a businessman. I grew up with equal emphasis on my spiritual life and my material life. And I started to meditate when I was 20 years old. I lost my son in my early 40s. Well, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Although biological function changed, I was able to meditate. So we work with these kids and we use the principle of spirituality because it's an internal navigation system. We connect the kids to their internal navigation system because if you're connected to your internal navigation system, you know it's wrong to lie, to cheat, to steal, to kill somebody. You do not have to be told. Tony, who took my son's life, had an external navigation system. He was under the orders of the gang leader, Busting Bones. So we respect all the wisdom traditions. We teach meditations. We also work with girls. We do yoga. We do nature trips. We share with the kids movies like Gandhi and Schindler's List to connect them to their spiritual system. We also use restorative justice, and the way we do that is we get the kids to take responsibility for their actions. Sometimes it takes a while to do that. We train them to ask forgiveness of the people they've harmed. Most of these kids are between 12 and 18. Once they take responsibility for their actions, they ask forgiveness of the people they've hurt. Forgive yourselves. But there's a 4th step, which I think is the most important step. To say that I did it, I'm sorry, forgive me, not enough. All of our Kanai kids go out there and work in the community. They have to change their behavior. No more gang banging, no more alcohol, no more drugs. And they give service and they make sure that other kids do not follow in their own footsteps. We have 4 full-time employees that work for the foundation, all ex-convicts. 5 years after the tragedy, I went to meet the young man who killed my son. And I remember that was a very transformative meeting. It's a tough thing to do, to come eyeball and eyeball to a person who murdered your child. But I recognized that for me to complete my journey of forgiveness, at some point I had to meet him. And at one point we were together for an hour and a half, and one point we were looking at each other, we locked eyes, and I'm looking in his eyes for a murderer. I did not see a murderer. I was able to look in his eyes, climb down and touch his humanity. Sure, he had done the worst possible thing. He'd taken the life of an innocent, unarmed human being. But that did not make him inhuman. I could tell that over the 5 years, he had done a lot of work on himself. He was polite, he was remorseful, he was articulate, he was well-behaved. He's a likable kid. He's not a bad boy. He made a bad choice. At that point, I told him, Tony, not only have I forgiven you, I want you to know that when you come out of prison, you have a job waiting for you at the foundation. He was 19 years old. I left, and the next day, the grandfather called me and said, Azim, that meeting you had with Tony was very transformative. I said, you know, it was for me too. In my 3rd book, I have a chapter which is titled Realize with Real Eyes. It's inspired by my meeting Tony. Sometimes too much judgment in these eyes, you have to look at your eyes from a very deep part. Sister Azim, it was a very transformative meeting for Tony. Tony told me, there goes a very special man. I murdered his one and only son. Not only has he forgiven me, he's offered me a job. Daddy, he calls his grandfather Daddy because he lived with him. Daddy, I'm not worthy of his forgiveness. I'm not worthy of his job offer, but I will be. At 22, he aced his GED, 94.5 percentile. He's 32 years old now. He reads 5 books a month. He's halfway done with his first degree in child psychology. And 6 months ago, he started to write poetry. He's not about gangs and guns and alcohol and violence. I know he would love to turn the clock back. But sometimes you can't. And I can't wait to get him out. I wasn't able to do it under the Schwarzenegger regime, but hopefully we have more compassion in our governor today, because he can commute his sentence. I think all of you would agree that Tony would be a lot more useful to society working with his grandfather and me. And I can't wait to see that. Thank you. Thank you. And when he is on stage and he says to the kids, when I was 11, I joined a gang. When I was 14, I murdered Mr. Khamiza's son. I spent the last umpteen years in prison. I'm here to tell you it's not worth it. I believe his voice will impact many kids because it will have the intonation of a person that pulled the trigger. I know we've saved him, but more importantly, he will save thousands and thousands of kids when he joins the Tariq Khamiza Foundation. So let me end with another quote, which I wrote after 9/11. I know everybody exactly knows where they were on 9/11. And it's heavy on our hearts. It's probably a little bit heavier on my heart because I am a practicing Muslim, and the perpetrators were from my faith. It's not the faith. It's politics, and that's a different conversation. And I went into a very deep introspection after 9/11, and 6 months later, I wrote this in my journal. Sustained goodwill creates friendship. Now that ought to be obvious. You don't make friends by bombing them, right? You make friends by extending goodwill. So sustained goodwill creates friendship. Sustained friendship creates trust. Sustained trust creates empathy. Sustained empathy creates compassion. Sustained compassion creates peace. So I call this my peace formula. Goodwill, friendship, trust, empathy, compassion, peace. But people always ask me, how do you extend goodwill to the person who murdered your child? I tell them I do it through forgiveness. As it's evident it worked for me, it worked for my family. What's a miracle? It worked for him and his family. And it can work for you and you and you and you and your families. Indeed, it can work for Israel and Palestine, North and South Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. It can work for the United States of America. So my sisters and brothers, let me leave you with this thought that peace is possible. How do I know that? Because I am at peace. Thank you very much, and namaste. Thank you.